Bob Blaskiewicz, something like that.
It starts with B, yeah.
Yeah. Has a PhD in English. He's a visiting assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin. He's recently assistant professor of Stockholm University, and his subject area is critical thinking, and he manages the first-year students coming in and advises them on how they should be studying and what they should be looking at. So I think that's a big job for him too. As a matter of fact, I thought we were going to dinner last night, but he had to stay in a hotel and grade papers, so he takes his job pretty seriously. He does specialize in World War II vets' writings, and he has conspiracy theories and extraordinary or paranormal claims that he investigates. So that's also one of his specialties. He's on the committee for the Skeptical Inquirer's Conspiracy Guy web columnist. And he's a regular on the weekly web show, The Virtual Skeptics. He's been very active in the programs with the CFI group of skeptics. His critical thinking and the humanities, it will be the topic today. It's a little unusual because we usually look at this from the science standpoint. And I thought it was interesting to see that somebody else is looking at this from another viewpoint. And so we will learn together as to how he ties this into the skeptics part of this program to have us look at what we are and how we look at the humanities from a critical thinking standpoint. So give it up now for Bob, and let's find out what's going on.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So, how are you doing? I am Bob Blaskiewicz. Thank you so much, Jerry, and the board for inviting me to come talk to you. I spent a good part of the last 15 years studying and writing about extraordinary claims like conspiracy theories and claims of the paranormal. And I use them to teach lessons in critical thinking to first-year students at Stockton University. The reason I use these claims in my courses is that you use the same tools to analyze these claims as you do for other claims across the disciplines that my students will go on to eventually study. It's been a happy confluence of events that lets me turn my interest in critical thinking into a full-time job. And I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you. Scientific skepticism is closely aligned with free thought, and most skeptics would identify as free thinkers, atheists, or just godless. There are some skeptics, and I would say, pretty good skeptics, who have not gone down that route. It's important, I think, to recognize that there are the two areas, skepticism and atheism, are kind of distinct, and I think that critical thinking and skepticism are more likely to lead to atheism than atheism leads naturally to skepticism or critical thinking. I use as my primary example Bill Nye, who is a card-carrying atheist, but hasn't enjoyed many of the benefits of scientific enlightenment. So when I started participating in meetups in Atlanta with the skeptics, one of the things that I really liked about what they're doing was the strong connection to the sciences. As a little kid, I tell you, I loved astronomy. That's what I thought I was going to do astronomy when I grew up, or maybe write about science. I've never given up that interest, though my life has taken me in other directions. But it was nice to reconnect with that. At the time, I was teaching college writing and argument courses. And a lot of the topics that are central to the classes that I was teaching, things like evidence and research, reason and persuasion. These all dovetailed very nicely into what the skeptics were doing, and I felt like I had something to contribute, something that was a little bit different. After all, most of the work done by my colleagues in the humanities was applying reason to evidence to make arguments. But, you know, honestly, you wouldn't realize that from many of the conversations that I've had over the years about the humanities at skeptical events. And as much as it pains me to say it, I think that scientific skepticism has a critical thinking problem when it comes to the humanities. So for this talk, I'd like to start with some stalwarts of scientific skepticism, and I think you'll recognize them. They're also pretty strong on free thought as well. And I want to show some of the problematic things that they've said about the humanities, and especially about philosophy, which is where a lot of the problems, I think, start. The most prominent voices in skepticism are science popularizers. And ever since Carl Sagan went to heaven in 1996, St. Carl, several science communicators have attempted to fill his considerable shoes. Skeptics want to see intelligent, knowledgeable commentary on the sciences in the public sphere to guide public debate. And the opinions of media-savvy science popularizers like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, Richard Dawkins, and Lawrence Krauss, the late Stephen Hawking, these hold a lot of sway among skeptics. These science communicators often have to contend with a frustratingly widespread form of anti-intellectualism and a distrust of expertise. And I think the consequences of that distrust of expertise they've made themselves clear in the last few years. Though there is, understandably, a long tradition of anti-intellectualism in American life. Nonetheless, often the way in which the science leaders I've just mentioned, have engaged with the humanities has been itself, in a word, anti-intellectual. I'll start with Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow. This goes back farther, but they opened their salvo in the war between what C.P. Snow called the two cultures, the sciences and humanities. In their 2010 book, The Grand Design, it opens, people have always asked, how can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Most of us do not spend most of our time worrying about these questions, but almost all of us worry about them some of the time. Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. These questions do fall within the scope of philosophy and philosophical inquiry. The astounding advances in human knowledge about the composition and scale of the universe over the past century, I think in no way diminishes the need to understand and interpret those discoveries, to make meaning out of them. The fact that we have better observations and better data to which we apply the tools offered by philosophy in no way impoverishes or kills philosophy, but greatly enhances it and enriches it. Other eminent public scientists have continued whipping this dead horse. In 2012, Ross Anderson of The Atlantic interviewed ASU's own theoretical physicist, Lawrence Krauss, about a hostile New York Times review of his book, A Universe from Nothing. Philosopher of science David Albert argued that Krauss ultimately failed to grapple with the proposition set forward in the title of the book, that the universe came from nothing. Albert argues that Krauss's formulation of the universe depends on pre-existing relativistic quantum fields, which are therefore a kind of something. Krauss's reply to the question, quote, why the sudden public antagonism between philosophy and physics is concerning. He claims that, without evidence, that philosophers resent science because it's encroaching on philosophers' turf. He goes on to say, and the worst part of philosophy is the philosophy of science. The only people, as far as I can tell, that read work by philosophers of science are other philosophers of science. It has no impact on physics whatsoever, and I doubt that other philosophers read it because it's fairly technical. And so it's really hard to understand what justifies it. And so I'd say that this tension occurs because people in philosophy feel threatened, and they have every right to feel threatened because science progresses and philosophy doesn't. Let's set aside for the moment the fact that you need a special type of evidence to assign motives to anyone, much less an entire field of study. Let's ignore the fact that philosophy of science does not pretend to do science or influence physics. Let's politely not point out that the only people who read theoretical physics journals are theoretical physicists. Let's leave it to the hard-working philosophers of mind who are exploring the implications of discoveries in neuroscience for the concept of self, discover the proposition that philosophy doesn't progress. In 2016, researchers using data from Google Scholar found that Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a work of philosophy and history of science, is the 9th most cited scholarly document ever, with well over 81,000 citations. Clearly, people in numerous disciplines have found ways to justify and benefit from the philosophy of science. Krauss's especially spiteful attitude in this regard is shared by Steven Pinker, who was also lashing out at criticism of his book. This time it was Enlightenment Now, by scholars who specialize in the history, literature, and philosophy of the period he names his book after. He said of them, some of the vitriol is turf protective. Some highbrow pundits, cultural critics, literary intellectuals, humanities professors, and other members of C.P. Snow's second culture resent the incursion of science, data, and quantification into territories traditionally fenced off and claimed by them. And a surprising number are cultural pessimists who despise the Enlightenment ideals of reason, science, humanism, and progress. They prefer hermeneutic, textual interpretations, to analytic reasoning. One of the reasons they're sympathetic to religion, even if they are atheists, valorize the consumption of elite art as opposed to the well-being of the mass of humanity as the highest moral good, and believe that Western civilization is on the verge of collapse and is so decadent and degenerate that anything that rises out of the rubble is bound to be an improvement. Now, there's no small amount of ego and unbacked speculation here, and none of it addresses the criticisms that Pinker's view of the Enlightenment is partial and misleading. As Aaron Hanlon observes, Pinker doesn't address or acknowledge that many important Enlightenment thinkers had decidedly illiberal ideas, and that the granddaddy of them all, Rousseau, was mostly opposed to progress. Pinker ignores the important point that the Enlightenment was not just a set of ideas, but it includes a complex set of social conditions, ways of getting around censorship, for instance, that allowed new ideas to emerge. And Hanlon lastly indicates Pinker treats, quote, Enlightenment thought about religion, science, and progress as if they were obviously true. But the whole point of the Enlightenment is that the ideas that we now take to be part of the Enlightenment, that we associate with the Enlightenment, were being hashed out and not at all obvious to the people at the time. When this is pointed out, Pinker essentially calls these people who have devoted their professional lives to the study of the Enlightenment enemies of the Enlightenment. So this next one hurts a little bit because I don't know if there's anybody whose passion for science is contagious as Neil deGrasse Tyson's, but he's long had some discouragingly ill-informed comments about the humanities. At the 2010 World Science Festival, he forcefully made a case for science literacy, but he did it using some pretty unfortunate caricatures of the liberal arts, which is so fractally bad, it's worth quoting at some length. So I know, I tell my students, don't give presentations with long, chunks of text, but I'm hoping that this is artistically justified. So I can tell you for what it's worth that scientists, by and large, are actually quite knowledgeable in areas outside of science. If you go to the home of most scientists, there will be Bach and Beethoven and Shakespeare on the shelves. And they might not know as much as the literary scholar, but one thing that I think as a nation we should be embarrassed by is that the scientists And you can do the experiment yourself. I've done the experiment. The scientists, by and large, know more liberal arts than the science that's known by liberal artists, and that needs to change. If you go to a science cocktail party and someone talks about Shakespeare, no one's going to say, oh, I was no good at Shakespeare, I was terrible at nouns and verbs. You know? No, you'll never hear that. But you can go to liberal arts or artist parties and someone will be talking about math and say, oh, I was never good at math, I hated math. And they'll all chuckle and they'll all agree and they'll all like sip the next sip of champagne and go on talking about the art. And that's somehow okay. No, that's not okay. You don't have to be a scientist, but at least understand what's going on in the world. Scientific decisions inform political decisions, and you all vote. So I'm here just to simply get you excited enough about science that you want to become scientifically literate. Otherwise, I'm not going to beat you over the head. Okay, wow. I did that whole damn thing. All right, yeah, so first, English teachers do hear. I was never good at English. I never could write. I never understood the point of studying Shakespeare. And I haven't read an entire book since high school all the time. It may be perfectly true that math teachers and astrophysicists don't hear it, but that's probably because of selection bias. Second, just because you see a book on the shelf doesn't mean its owner has read it or is, quote, quite knowledgeable about it. Third, the phrase, they might not know as much as the literary scholar in Tyson's comments, comes nowhere close to acknowledging the magnitude of the gulf between somebody who has Moby Dick on their shelves and someone who wrote their dissertation on the American Renaissance. I may not know as much as a geologist, but I have some pretty rocks on my shelves, is probably just as grating to the ears of a scientist, right? And finally, it's a little shifty to set up, if you tart up an uncorroborated anecdote, which can't reveal what he implies it does, by calling it an experiment, which of course it isn't. This is rank, uninhibited anti-intellectualism, and it is not skepticism. So where does this animus come from? One hint may be found at the end of noted science guy Bill Nye's 2016 Big Think video about philosophy. Does anyone remember that one? Anyone? Bueller? Okay. No. As part of his Tuesdays with Bill series, a young man sends in a video to Bill Nye, and he says, Bill, I'm a philosophy major in college right now, and I'm looking for your opinion on a subject. Some scientists like Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson have brushed it off as a meaningless topic. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the subject. And then after that, Nye mistakes all philosophy for a really, really bad reading of Descartes' cogito ergo sum argument, and then he issues a warning. Just keep in mind, if you're spending all this money on college, this also may be where Neil and Richard are coming from. A philosophy degree may not lead you to lead you on a career path. It might, but it may not. And so before I go on, I want to say that of the people who I'm talking about, I think that Bill Nye deals with criticism better than these other science communicators. When he was called out, he considered the idea that he might be wrong, and he took, I believe he took a philosophy class, and he came to a new conclusion. And he's done that before on the issue of GMOs. So I think Nye, he really seems to get it. I think he's trying to put critical thinking into everyday practice. I like that. I think he's laudable for that. So. Anyway, when Nye originally wonders if the poor philosophy student will be employable, he seems to be drawing on a larger argument related to the purpose of higher education in the US. As the cost of education goes up and as student debt amasses, students, parents, and legislators increasingly ask if college is worth it. Or put another way, whether students are seeing a return on their investment. Deep down, this is a question about what does society want to get out of college graduates, and the answer in turn affects the course offerings and funding priorities of institutions. As a result, the humanities and the sciences have felt competitive pressures to demonstrate their practical economic utility, and academics often feel like their programs are perpetually at risk. If you examine this fairly uncontroversial list of the humanities, this is the list that's used by the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, English literature and language, speech and rhetoric, foreign languages, history of philosophy, religion, and non-sectarian study of religion is legit. You know, when somebody's study is just another version of their worship, then it's not really humanities. Ethnic, gender, cultural studies, American studies, archaeology, jurisprudence, art history, and interdisciplinary studies like Holocaust studies or medieval studies, that sort of thing. When you try to come up with a definitive slam dunk answer to the question, what are the humanities for? The question is misguided, since the humanities are for lots of things. To satisfy our curiosity about our past and to preserve it, to examine how human thought evolves over time and has changed, to generate interesting conversations, to create flexible mental structures that allow us to imagine being inside the heads of other people, to communicate with people who do not speak one's own language, to analyze and interpret information, to produce well-informed citizens who have a broad enough knowledge base that they can accommodate and entertain counterintuitive or controversial ideas without retreating into dogma and tribalism, and to produce critical thinkers. These are just a couple of the things that the humanities are for, not to mention just the sheer pleasure of studying some of these topics in the humanities. So in his article about Pinker, Hanlon gave a name to this weird crusade waged on the humanities by some science popularizers. Pinker's unfortunately caught up in a larger culture war in which self-styled rationalists view to identity politics of rationalism to counter what they view as pernicious postmodernism in English, history, and philosophy departments. And I've come across the postmodern boogeyman many times in my skeptical career. Once at the amazing meeting in 2012, which was at the time was the place to be for critical thinkers and skeptics. I was a member of a panel on skepticism in the humanities. We spent an hour or so talking about all the things that the humanities had to offer skepticism. And then in the lunch line, right after the presentation, a woman in front of me was actually angry. She didn't realize I was right behind her, and she was actually angry that they had a panel about this at this, critical thinking and science conference. And I believe I reminded that critical thinking is not the exclusive domain of the sciences, and that where we actually teach critical thinking explicitly is in the sciences, in the first-year writing courses and in philosophy courses. We name the fallacies. We show the critical thinking pitfalls. We address bias and that sort of stuff. But yeah, so I've since come to suspect that most people who dislike the humanities because of postmodernism believe what they do because of the Sokal hoax. The Sokal hoax was a hoax in 1996 when physicist Alan Sokal submitted a bogus paper, and this is genuinely funny, transgressing the boundaries toward a hermeneutics of quantum gravity to postmodern journal Social Text, where that article was eventually published. He exposed the nonsense in another magazine, much to the embarrassment of the editors. Though it should be noted, and a lot of people forget this, that Social Text was not a peer-reviewed journal at the time. I believe it is now. But yeah, and it's funny. I once gave a talk about the problems that postmodernism has with empirical reality, or post-structuralism has with empirical reality in some quarters. And after the talk, a guy came up to me and he said, "Yeah, my dissertation advisor is one of those editors. They took classes in science after that." And I was like, "Good, that's what we want to see," But yeah, so most skeptics and science enthusiasts seem to think that Sokal demonstrated that the humanities were corrupted by leftist political pontification and lax standards. For all the enduring furor over this hoax, Sokal himself has been modest about what he demonstrated. Let me see, did this go? Nope. From the mere fact of publication of my parody, I think that not much can be deduced. It doesn't prove that the whole field of cultural studies or cultural studies of science, much less sociology of science, is nonsense. Nor does it prove that the intellectual standards in these fields are generally lax. This may be the case, but it would have to be established on other grounds. It proves only that the editors of one rather marginal journal were derelict in their intellectual duty. But this isn't how the hoax is generally remembered. The scandal still evokes strong emotions from academics in both the humanities and the sciences, and its significance has reverberated in popular culture ever since. Peter Boghossian still keeps trying to relive it. He's a philosopher. He just did Sokal Squared, where he sent out a whole bunch of fake, he and a couple of people sent out a bunch of fake articles that were eventually published. The Sokal hoax is a convenient trope for opinion havers like George Will, who reflected 20 years after the fact, quote, "One lesson of Sokal's hoax is that many educators are uneducatable." Another is that although wonderful send-ups have been written about academia, it might be beyond satire. James Pearson and Naomi Schaefer Riley commemorated the 20th anniversary of the hoax by opining in the Weekly Standard. Today, most academics working in the humanities appear to have dismissed the Sokal hoax as a minor mishap and the unfolding of an important intellectual trend. Yes, there was some discomfiture, but neither the journal nor its editors suffered any long-term damage as a result of the hoax. The intellectual currents of postmodernism persist. Sokal's original hoax may have ridiculed left-wing Kant, but it did little to blunt the ascendancy of the left on campus. Fewer professors today would dare to take on the postmodernists in the manner Sokal did 2 decades ago. This should serve as a warning to those who think that professors in the hard sciences might act as a check on the absurdities committed by their colleagues in the humanities. I'm not sure that professors in the sciences are necessarily qualified to put a check on the humanities. So personally, the most disappointing response to my project of explaining what the humanities have to offer the realm of critical thinking came when my colleague and I, her name's Eve Siebert, she's a medievalist, we queried a book publisher about, with a solid science and critical thinking catalog, about whether they'd be willing to accept a book proposal called "Was Shakespeare an Alien? Critical Thinking in the Humanities." He wasn't an alien. But the reply that we got back from the publisher was pretty amazing. Thank you for making us aware of your project on skepticism in the humanities. We have long been an advocate of critical thinking, constructive skepticism, and the proper use of scientific reasoning to address issues and questions that required public discussion and debate. Certainly the humanities are not immune from such analysis and may well need to be called to account for their lapses into irrationalism. Please send your sample chapters along with an annotated table of contents. One thing that I hope you will address is the horrific plunge the humanities engaged in when it embraced deconstructionism and postmodernism as a critical approach, hook, line, and sinker. What about what some would consider the contemporary universities, and by extension the humanities, nearly uncritical embrace of political correctness on campus and elsewhere, being used as a vehicle, whether knowingly or otherwise, for bludgeoning, stifling, or having a chilling effect on alternative points of view, rather than countering unpopular views with rational arguments and evidence. Out of sheer cheek, I added a chapter to my proposal called "The Importance of Theology and Postmodernism" to the proposal. This is exactly the attitude that we hope to fight. You didn't actually read our letter, I guess. When we try to talk about the humanities to skeptics. Our book was, of course, not picked up, but hell, I got a great slide out of it. So a couple of really grossly simplified definitions, because people seem to use postmodernism and post-structuralism and deconstruction interchangeably. They're related, but they're not equivalent. Post-structuralism is a philosophical movement that examines how meaning is constructed, what role power plays in the construction of meaning, and which attempts to disrupt power structures by exposing contradictions at the heart of meaning. An analytical process that they use, the post-structuralists use to expose those contradictions, is called deconstruction. the artistic movement or style that explores the themes relevant to post-structuralism, like disruption and non-continuity and collage and that sort of thing, is called postmodernism. So this is what we got. Post-structuralism is a philosophy. Postmodernism is an artistic movement or style. Deconstruction is an analytical tool. All right. So the first thing that falls out of these definitions is that when skeptics complain about the pernicious philosophy rotting the brains of undergraduates and faculties, they're criticizing post-structuralism, not actually postmodernism. Pulp Fiction, Christopher Nolan movies, Catch-22, and Yoko Ono records are not challenging or trying to challenge the authority of science or the notion of an objective reality, as some extreme forms of post-structuralism do. Even I, lapse into this sometimes. So let's talk about post-structuralism, the philosophy. Where does it come from? And what is it trying to do? So post-structuralism arose and gained popularity in the context of 1960s and 70s French philosophy. I know, fun stuff. And at the time, France and other Western countries were experiencing student-led social upheavals, and at times it seemed like the social order might actually break down. In May 1968, turmoil in France actually threatened revolution, but conservative Gaullists overwhelmingly trounced the opposition in elections the next month and reinforced established structures of authority, including, surprisingly perhaps, linguistic norms. To understand the significance of both the political radicalism and the liberatory relativism that post-structuralism came to represent, you need to recognize that France deals with its national language and exercises official control over its proper usage in a pretty regulated way. The Académie Française exercises official control over the proper usage and upholds a very conservative standard for the language. For instance, it resists changes like the incorporation of loanwords from other languages into its official dictionary. The decisions about grammar that they make don't have the force of law, but they exert influence, and the Academy awards numerous prizes each year. Additionally, the French president is the protector of the Academy, and this would have been de Gaulle himself in 1968, which I think most student protesters would have found de Gaulling. Oh yeah, still got it. All right, so, and then people start leaving. Oh well. But yeah, so in the words of Terry Eagleton, who was a Marxist commentator, post-structuralism was the product of that blend of euphoria and disillusionment, liberation and dissipation, carnival and catastrophe, which was 1968. Unable to break the structures of state power, post-structuralism found it possible to subvert the structures of language. The student movement was flushed off the streets and driven underground into discourse. Its enemies became coherent belief systems of any kind. In particular, all forms of political theory and organization which sought to analyze and act upon the structures of society as a whole. All total systemic thought was now suspect as terroristic. Conceptual meaning itself was feared as repressive. So in this repressive linguistic regime, French academics in the late 1960s resisted these conservative tendencies by basically playing with language. Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology is considered a foundational work in the area, which is kind of ironic given that the philosophy itself that it spawned eschews foundational knowledge. But Derrida's treatise on German philosophy is a riot of wordplay, of multiple meanings and radical rereadings of well-studied texts. And he suggests that the works of these German authors are intrinsically contradictory, and by extension, any meaning was elusive and illusory. The process he uses to hint at that conclusion is deconstruction. From the outside, and in translation where nuance and where wordplay is often lost, Of Grammatology can seem impenetrable. And when I first read it, I had no idea what, I looked through my copy from graduate school, and I had things that I didn't understand that had stars next to them. And, I must have thought it was important at the time. But in that literary theory class, a couple weeks later, we started reading some German philosophers that he was talking about, and it turns out that he actually had some good insights and provocative insights. So, I mean, you can get something out of it, but you have to know something about the German philosophers, I think, first, and also speak French and enjoy French puns, and build a philosophy out of French puns. In the popular mind, post-structural philosophy and postmodernism have been conflated. This is an entirely understandable error, as the academic essays written with the intention of exposing and challenging established forms of authoritative discourse are likely trying to embody that disruption, right? This is to say that post-structuralist scholarship is very often written in a postmodern style. So instead of attacking a thesis head-on, it may dance around the point, leaving it open, itself open to interpretation. It can be frustrating. They may indulge in wordplay and play up the multiplicity of meanings that they find in language. They might focus on binary opposites, a form of meaning making that is of great concern to post-structuralists. They may employ the deconstructive technique of not only closely reading texts, but like Talmudically close readings of text, where every possible metaphor and every possible nuance of meaning is squeezed for all it's worth, and all of them are explored. And the idea that no meaning was ever fixed, that could ever be fixed even in theory, and always contradictory, seem to invite ever more radical interpretations of written and spoken texts. This type of analysis has excited scholars in certain areas of the humanities, specifically in cultural studies and in literary theory, where shifting and multiple meanings are found in texts and in cultural practices all the time. What these academics were doing also seemed politically potent. Reimagining deeply ingrained cultural practices and beliefs can indeed threaten established orders, disrupt politics, and redistribute power. I think that the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, and what the Parkland kids are doing are threatening entrenched cultural practices and norms because they're changing the terms of debate and who can participate in the debate. So, all right, so this one, now you're gonna have to bear with me. This is a portrait of Gertrude Stein by Pablo Picasso. Behold, the woman, Gertrude Stein. There's something, what's wrong with her face? Huh? Yeah, it's not symmetric. How is it not symmetric? Okay, so the eyes look off somehow. If you cover one eye with your thumb, right, and then you cover the other eye, it works. It looks like a normal face either way, right? But together they don't quite work. What's that? What is Picasso doing there? I'm sorry? He is playing, right? Yeah. It's because she's painted from two different perspectives. In one case, on the left, he was closer to her, and then when he painted the right side, he was farther away from her, right? So there are two different perspectives here, and this is what we call multi-perspectivism. I think he's saying that the controlling perspective of the artist, as traditionally conceived up to that point, has been misleading. It gives you a limited version of the truth. In some ways, in a portrait which incorporates multiple perspectives, like Cubism does, at least acknowledges that a dominant, hegemonic perspective distorts reality. And recognizing that allows you to start seeking other perfectly valid perspectives. Cubism complicates our reality. Deconstruction, the method of analysis used in post-structuralism, also seeks to problematize things and make things more complicated. It takes apparent or accepted truths and shows that they're either simplified or steeped in unacknowledged ideological bias. That's what they're trying to do. Ideologies are said to be dominant when they exclude alternate narratives, when they keep out multi-perspectivism. When a group exercises a hegemonic authority over a culture, say, white men, for instance, the stories the culture tells about itself, either in fiction or in history or any of the other things that people in the humanities study, these stories tend to validate that group's perspective, and if they didn't, well, then white men wouldn't be hegemonic. So this opens up numerous, post-structuralism opens up numerous legitimate areas of study in the humanities: feminist studies, LGBTQ studies, African American studies, post-colonial studies, and other varieties of cultural studies, which show collectively how varied the human experience is. So, hold on a sec. So, post-structural critical theories, as you might expect given their origin, often are imbued with the sort of righteousness or political commitment that the theorist in some ways is crusading against an oppressive hegemonic force, right? This is especially true in what Jonathan Gottschall called the liberationist paradigm, in which, quote, objectivity is just a synonym for white male subjectivity. And you do see that new schools of theory do seem to arise alongside political movement. So you take eco-criticism, which is closely aligned with modern environmentalism. Eco-critic Simon Estock says that, quote, eco-criticism has distinguished itself, debates notwithstanding, first by the ethical stand it takes. Its commitment to the natural world is an important thing rather than simply as an object of thematic study, and secondly, by its commitment to making connections. The editors of the Eco-Crit collection, Reading the Earth, argue that, quote, implicit and often explicit in much of this new criticism is a call for cultural change. Eco-criticism is not just a means of analyzing nature and literature, it implies a move towards a more biocentric worldview, an extension of ethics, a broadening of humans' conception of global community to include non-human life and the physical environment. Just as feminist and African American literary criticism calls for a change in culture, so too does ecological literary criticism advocate for cultural change by examining how the narrowness of our culture's assumptions about the natural world has limited our ability to envision an ecologically sustainable human society. It's interesting. In much the same way that conspiracy theories are fueled, my area of interest, conspiracy theories are fueled by political ideals. Take for instance a 9/11 truther who are convinced that they're exposing great evils, no matter how silly, and the anti-communists of the Cold War period who are convinced that they were doing no less than saving freedom itself. So too have some critical theorists seen themselves as waging a good war on behalf of oppressed people, and in the case just mentioned, saving human society from itself. At some point, some theorists in these disciplines saw deconstruction as a means not merely to challenge the accepted meaning of things, and our understanding of how we make meaning, but the existence of things themselves. Now, they began treating objects in the real world as if they were texts, whose reality was as elusive as the meaning of the words we assigned to those objects. In doing so, they sought to inject political revolution into physical reality. Mistaking objects for texts led to some far out and questionable scholarship. As an authoritative epistemology, empirical science must have seemed like to be the arch nemesis of relativism. And by the 1980s, some cultural and literary theorists were taking a whack at science, seeking to overthrow or undermine its epistemological authority. And this is, you can see this as being kind of consistent with what was going on in France in the 60s. Some especially egregious examples of crack pottery came from psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who posited a, quote, psychoanalytic topology in which, quote, the cut on a torus corresponds to the neurotic subject, and who asserted that the erectile organ comes to symbolize the place of jouissance, not in itself or even in the form of an image, but as a part lacking in the desired image. That is why it is equivalent to the square root of -1 of the significance produced above, of the enjoyment that it restores by the coefficient of its statement to the function of the lack of signifier, which literally means nothing, right? It's science word salad is what it is. And Lacan, he takes the worst of psychoanalysis and the worst of deconstruction and just explodes them. So there are no fixed references to meaning in that at all. Yeah. Another example would be Luce Irigary's form of feminism, as she memorably asked, is E equals MC squared a sexed equation? Perhaps it is. Let us make the hypothesis that it is insofar as it privileges the speed of light over other speeds that are vitally necessary to us. What seems to me to indicate the possibly sexed nature of the equation is not directly its uses by nuclear weapons. Okay. Rather, it's having privileged what goes the fastest. Okay. Irigary also put forward an unfortunate theory of fluid dynamics, again seeing privilege where there is really only equations. The theory was summarized by one of Irigary's followers. The privileging of solid over fluid dynamics, and indeed the inability of science to deal with turbulent flow at all, Irigary attributes to the association of fluidity with femininity. Whereas men have sex organs that protrude and become rigid, women have openings that leak menstrual blood and vaginal fluids. Yeah, okay. You have this kind of, it's just like a really, really, really bad analogy. These types of proclamations that have come to characterize post-structuralist thought in the minds of many of the most important science popularizers. And yes, these are genuinely absurd. But they also become stand-ins for the whole philosophy, which is unfair. And philosophy has become a stand-in for all of the humanities. And this is weird because I don't think most philosophers would have much to do with post-structuralism, for the simple reason that radical relativism actually is self-contradictory, literally violates the laws of logic, in one case the law of non-contradiction, as Theodore Schick and Louis Vaughan put it in How to Think About Weird Things. According to the relativist, everything is relative. To say that everything is relative is to say that no unrestricted universal generalizations are true. An unrestricted universal generalization is a statement to the effect that something holds for all individual societies or conceptual schemes. The statement, no unrestricted universal generalizations are true, is itself an unrestricted universal generalization. So if relativism in any of its forms is true, it's false. As a result, it cannot possibly be true, right? And so extreme relativism had very little chance, I think, of really taking hold in philosophy departments, and that's why you kind of see it in literary theory and cultural criticism. There is encouraging news, and that's the number of practitioners of theory who fall into the category I've just outlined are comparatively few in number. You rarely bump into somebody outside of a specialty journal, maybe, who espouses wholehearted devotion to a single school of thought. I don't know that I've ever met anyone who is totally deconstructed. Nonetheless, the theorists whose work is taken to be representative of the various schools of criticism, they also tend to be more sensationalistic. A peculiar feature of this theory is the tacit appreciation of its mere boldness, as if claims of radical destabilization are laudable in and of themselves. A famous example is the conclusion of Sandra Harding's book, The Science Question in Feminism, where she says, when we began theorizing our experience, we knew our task would be a difficult, though exciting one. But I doubt that in our wildest dreams we ever imagined we would have to reinvent both science and theorizing itself to make sense of women's social experience. And I mean, they forgot to tell the people at CERN that science had been redone, but that's about as bold a claim as I can imagine, to actually have imagined science itself. It's even bolder than when she called Newton's Principia a rape manual. Nonetheless, when these rare and disproportionately loud theorists declaim on subjects about which they know nothing, they devalue the work of other more responsible scholars through an unfair guilt by association. Further, it perpetuates the idea that the universities are merely indoctrination centers for intolerant leftist nut jobs, which is another dangerous assault on expertise that we've seen in the last several years. So why does this stuff get published at all? Right? I think the answer to that lies in how the humanities use other people's research. In the sciences, every link in this logical chain in the argument that they're making has to be good, or else it falls apart. In the humanities, it's not always like that. Sometimes we tend to pick and choose what's useful and what's relevant to whatever it is that we happen to be studying. Even the more goofy critical theorists, and this is important to remember, I mean, Irigaray, okay, she says some pretty crazy stuff in my opinion. However, she has read a lot about feminism. When you have, and they're clever and inventive, and when you have a clever, inventive person writing, you know, nonsense mostly, you may come up with some really interesting juxtapositions or provocative ideas that you can seize on and explore. You will also benefit largely from their enormous bibliographies, which may well be exhaustive. So there are other reasons to read this stuff, not just the conclusions, you know, and sometimes despite the conclusions, there may be valuable stuff in there, stuff that we can use. So yeah, there is a real danger in disregarding the genuine the expertise of scholars in the humanities. And this is a fun example. A few years ago, there was the Harvard Theological Review published a fragment of a papyrus written by Karen King, who is a well-regarded leading scholar of women in the early church. The fragment that she presented in this journal, it was about as big as a business card, is how it was consistently described. And not all of it was legible. But what could be read was, Jesus said to them, "My wife," and in the next line, "She is able to be my disciple." Now this is, in this particular area of expertise, potentially a huge thing. Because if this fragment is a part of an early lost account of Jesus' life, it doesn't point to the existence of Jesus or his divine nature, but it would point to a tradition in the early church that women could assume positions of power, and this might have an effect on how people think about whether or not women in the church are allowed to do what they should be able to do. And so it was important and potentially groundbreaking. It also seems really specific, which is a little, a little suspicious. The papyrus fragment was subjected to forensic analysis. Carbon dating confirmed that the fragment was old. Within a couple of hundred years, the ink had the same chemistry as inks appropriate for the time. And so while these are necessary conditions for the fragment to be deemed authentic, and this is the fragment here. This is not actual size. And even though this fragment was written on old paper in an old language, or old papyrus in an old language, these aren't sufficient conditions for proving that it's authentic. Even so, the press ran with it. And this may be just a well-known problem with how the press reports on science, kind of a superficial way. No forgery evidence seen in Gospel of Jesus' Wife papyrus. Scientific tests show Gospel of Jesus' Wife wasn't faked, right? But they were wrong. Not about the age. They got the age of the papyrus right. They actually placed it in the medieval period, which is problematic for how early this tradition is. But they didn't even have to submit it to that analysis, because people who teach Coptic, the language in which it's written, said that it was a transparent fraud. One of the scholars described the language it was written in as Keystone Coptic, which I love. And it's almost as if the person was lifting individual words they found in a different text and was reassembling them in syntactically unprecedented ways. And it turns out that source text was an interlinear edition of the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas, which has all of the words and all of the forms in it, and I believe there's a spelling error or something that was reproduced. And that was published online in 1997. So that is actually the earliest date it could possibly be. This is part of a pattern, I think, to science the humanities, and it's an impulse I understand. And you can get some interesting stuff out of it. If you look at, I forget what the field's called, but analyzing Shakespeare, looking at linguistic analysis using computers to find out which parts were written by Shakespeare himself. I think that's an interesting way of quantifying something that normally people wouldn't think is quantifiable, and possibly advancing human knowledge through that, even though all of those observations were originally, that are fed into the computer, were made by people in the humanities and Shakespeare specialists. I think that that's a useful and potentially fruitful use of scientific methodology. And sometimes interdisciplinary collaboration is really fruitful. I think of something like how history and archaeology and genetics and literary studies and theology, historical theology, geography and geophysical surveys, dendrochronology, environmental sciences, and how all these build up together complex understandings of long lost cultures and their interaction with their environments. I think this is fascinating. It's some of the most fruitful and wonderful scholarship out there. And I would certainly like the humanities to build upon as strong as an epistemological basis as possible, but I'm not sure that the sciences are not necessarily advanced enough to cope yet with the varieties of human experience. Thank you. Or, is no longer advancing. It's froze. Well, I guess it froze at the right time. Do we have questions? Just it, It's the same slide as the beginning, so it's fine. Any question? Hi.
Okay, so what do you think of John Horgan and the End of Science?
I don't know who that is. What's the argument?
No, he wrote a whole book entitled The End of Science.
Okay. What's the argument? That science...
It's kind of a roundabout book, but it's basically application of literary criticism to science.
I think that's very dangerous. To mistake reality for a text. Literary criticism is, I think, most fruitfully applied to literature, and unless you're dealing with physics and science on the same terms as the experts, then you're going to wander.
It's at least one of your examples that the conclusion may be wrong, but the journey was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you can do that.
I could recommend it. There's a lot of good stuff in that book.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
At the beginning, you said some skeptics have not become atheists. Do you have any clue as to why that might be?
Because we live in a culture that's deeply steeped in Christianity, and sometimes people don't let go of religion. They reconcile it to themselves. And actually, very clever people are really good at reconciling contradictory beliefs to themselves. Okay. So they're really good thinkers out there who also happen to be Christians. It's a possible thing.
All right, and my second question is, let's see, what was it? You asked a question about why some of these things were published. Mm-hmm. How could they be published? And I'd like your opinion about the kind of requirement to publish or perish for people in academia.
I think that's a problem when you're. And I understand the impulse to want to advance your field, that you want to have people who are, cutting edge and pushing boundaries, teaching. But I think that there's a lot to be said for the value of public outreach. One of the things that I'm grateful for is that my university encourages me, as part of my requirements for tenure, is to do public events and public engagement. Scholarship of engagement is what they call it. But it also creates perverse incentives, and I think can corrupt best practices. That's That's my opinion. Yeah.
Most of this was above my head, but I do have a question.
Sorry.
You talk about skeptics and you talk about critical thinking. To my mind, there's a difference. The first thing is recognizing the facts, and the second thing is acting or coming to a conclusion on the facts. And that would separate a skeptic from a rational thinker, I think. And I just wonder if you could elaborate on the most important thing is how do we recognize facts rather than misrecognizing them?
Yeah, an important part of critical thinking, from my perspective, a working definition that I use with my students is thinking about your thinking, so that you can think better, so that you realize that you have biases and prejudices and ideological commitments and emotions that may override your reasoning abilities at times, so that it's important to recognize those flags when you have a strong emotional reaction to something, for instance, that perhaps you step back and think, maybe I'm not getting this all right. Maybe I should take a second look. And one of the things that you would, that I ask my students to do is, when I present them with something like a conspiracy theory, are these facts in fact correct? Are they facts? And so I can see, I think my view of critical thinking can accommodate your idea of skepticism. But yeah, we want to improve the quality of thought, both in terms of recognizing, identifying facts, and then applying reason to those facts to come to reasonable conclusions and defensible conclusions. Yep.
How do you determine the difference between facts and alternate facts?
Oh, God. How do you Yeah. Well, whoever shouts it louder is right, usually. No. Although, boy, that's tough. Because the line isn't often as clear as we'd like to imagine, sometimes things can be alternate facts just by mere exclusion of context, right? And then placed somewhere else. So you really do have to, it takes work to be a critical thinker and to identify when something is actually likely to be true. I tell my students that reading is hard, because if you want to be a good reader, you have to be willing to take the time and fact check these people that you're reading. Especially if you're not reading widely to begin with. You really have to focus on these understanding statements in context, motivations, ideological motivations of writers, who they think their audience is. That sort of stuff is all really important. So yeah, I wish I had a slam dunk answer for that, but the line's hard, and it requires work. Yep.
You talked about the humanists talking about science, and maybe artists, in terms of science. Is it Gödel's, Escher, and Bach an absolute point where they've come together?
Oh, I like Escher,
Escher and Gödel's and Bach.
And then Bach with the counterpoint. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can have some really fruitful mergings of science and humanities and artistic production. Without a doubt. I totally agree with that.
And Gödel's in mathematics.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with math.
Okay, yeah.
I didn't go into astronomy.
They're the same kind of abstract concepts in those three areas that seem to be the same.
No, I agree that you can produce some really phenomenal stuff when you do like cross-disciplinary work like that. Yeah, and I love Escher. Yep.
Yeah, I think most of us think that logic and critical thinking are pretty much the same thing, but I think there are some differences. Logic kind of you make assumptions, but the assumptions may not be true. Can you differentiate between critical thinking and logic?
Oh boy. You ask harder questions than my students do. Is there a difference between critical thinking and logic? You can build coherent logical arguments that are internally consistent and totally absurd. And I would not say that sticking to those is critical thinking. You know what I mean? A lot of the reasoning through, given, you think about the way that the earliest natural scientists, which was basically philosophy at the time, right? Imposed, perfection on the universe and imagined that it had to be perfect, and they just bent over backwards to try to get the harmony of the spheres just right. That wasn't exactly critical thinking. They did a good job with the logic, but it wasn't exactly critical thinking. So there is a difference there. Recognizing when something is not logical is a part of critical thinking, but logic in and of itself doesn't get you there.
Thank you for
So
coming.
much appreciate it.
Let's big hand.